The rain had already soaked through the ambulance bay when the shouting reached the nurse's station, sharp enough to cut through the constant chorus of ringing monitors and hurried footsteps, and every head turned just in time to watch an angry visitor point directly at the quiet nurse whose scarred hands were calmly fastening an elderly patient's oxygen mask. "I don't want someone who looks like that touching my father," the man snapped loudly enough for half the emergency department to hear, his words hanging in the antiseptic air with a cruelty that made even the fluorescent lights seem colder. A few younger employees exchanged uneasy glances while one of them lowered her eyes to hide an embarrassed smile, another whispering something that ended with the word accident before both returned to pretending they were busy, yet the woman standing at the center of every stare never lifted her voice or defended herself. She simply finished adjusting the patient's blanket with the same careful precision she had used 1,000 times before, her scarred fingers moving gently despite the thick ridges that crossed her skin like pale rivers carved by old fire. The badge clipped neatly to her navy uniform identified her only as Emma Lawson, registered nurse, while the years written quietly into the corners of her eyes suggested someone who had learned long ago that not every wound deserved an explanation. The emergency department smelled of disinfectant, wet jackets, coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, and exhaustion that seemed to settle into every chair and hallway before sunrise. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, bringing another wave of ambulances toward an already overflowing hospital, and inside every available pair of hands mattered. Emma crossed the polished floor without hesitation, her shoes barely making a sound as she answered one call light after another, checking medications, reassuring frightened children, comforting anxious families, and speaking in the steady voice of someone whose calm seemed almost impossible to disturb. Patients who had never met her relaxed within minutes of hearing her speak. Crying children stopped crying. Confused elderly patients settled after she gently repeated the same sentence again and again without a trace of frustration. New nurses often wondered how she remained composed when everyone else was overwhelmed, but few ever asked. People noticed the scars first. They rarely noticed the patients beneath them. Near the medication room, 2 interns quietly watched her pass. One leaned closer to the other and whispered that she looked like she had survived an explosion. The second shrugged and answered that maybe she had, though judging by her silence she probably did not like talking about it. Neither realized Emma had heard every word. She always did. Years of listening for danger had sharpened her hearing long before she ever stepped inside a hospital, and careless whispers carried farther than people imagined. Yet she continued walking as though the comments belonged to someone else entirely. Her attention remained fixed on the frightened little girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit in Trauma Room 4. Kneeling beside the bed, Emma ignored the curious stare directed toward the scars stretching from beneath her collar to the edge of her jaw. Instead, she asked the child about the rabbit's name. Within seconds, they were discussing imaginary tea parties instead of broken bones. The girl's trembling shoulders relaxed. Her mother exhaled for what felt like the first time all evening. Across the room, the attending physician noticed the transformation and quietly smiled. He had seen it happen countless times. There was something about Emma that made fear lose its grip without anyone understanding exactly how she accomplished it. During the brief lull that followed, she slipped into the staff locker room and opened the dented metal door marked with her name. Hanging neatly beside her spare uniform was a faded canvas pouch no larger than a folded hand towel. She touched it only for a second before closing the locker again. No one had ever seen what rested inside. To everyone else it was simply another forgotten keepsake. To Emma it was a reminder that some promises were carried rather than spoken. The overhead speaker interrupted the silence with another emergency alert. A multi-vehicle collision was arriving in less than 5 minutes. Every available nurse hurried toward the trauma bays, gathering equipment with practiced urgency. Emma reached hers first, checking airway supplies, blood tubing, and emergency medications so quickly that a new nurse struggled to keep pace. "How do you always know what comes next?" the younger woman asked breathlessly. Emma offered only the smallest smile. "People become easier to help when you prepare before they panic." It was the longest sentence she had spoken all shift. Minutes later the ambulance doors burst open. Stretchers rolled across the floor in rapid succession, accompanied by soaked paramedics shouting blood pressures, oxygen levels, and injury reports. Emma moved through the chaos with remarkable precision. Her voice never rose above conversation level, yet everyone nearby somehow heard every instruction. Gloves snapped into place. Compresses were applied. Intravenous lines appeared almost effortlessly beneath her hands. Even the demanding visitor who had insulted her earlier stood frozen as he watched her stabilize a young accident victim whose pulse had nearly disappeared. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. They simply watched. An elderly patient sitting quietly near the nurse's station followed Emma with thoughtful eyes before softly calling her name. She stopped immediately and walked over. The old man studied her face for several seconds before offering a respectful nod. "You carry yourself like someone who's heard helicopters before they were close enough to see," he murmured. Emma paused just long enough for the faintest shadow to cross her expression before answering with gentle kindness. "You should focus on getting stronger, Mr. Dawson." The veteran smiled knowingly but asked no further questions. Some forms of recognition require no explanation. Hours passed. Rain continued hammering against the windows while the emergency department settled into the strange rhythm familiar only to hospitals that never truly slept. Just as Emma finished updating a patient's chart, the automatic entrance doors slid open once again. 7 broad-shouldered men entered without speaking, dressed in ordinary civilian jackets that somehow failed to hide the discipline in the way they walked. Their eyes scanned the room with effortless coordination before stopping on the quiet nurse beside the nurse's station. Every one of them halted at exactly the same moment. Then, without exchanging a single word, the men straightened instinctively, their expressions shifting from determined purpose to profound respect, and the oldest among them took one slow step forward as if he had finally found someone he had spent years hoping was still alive. The oldest man stopped only a few feet from Emma. Yet for several long seconds he said nothing at all. Around him the emergency department continued moving in scattered fragments of urgency, monitors chiming, stretchers rolling, distant voices calling medication orders, but inside the small circle that had formed between the 7 visitors and the quiet nurse, the world seemed to surrender to silence. Then, in one perfectly practiced motion, every man raised his hand in a formal salute. Nurses froze in the middle of charting. Physicians looked up from patient files. Even the impatient visitor who had mocked Emma earlier lowered his eyes, unable to understand why men who carried themselves with unmistakable military precision would salute an ordinary emergency room nurse with such solemn respect. Emma's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly before she returned the gesture with only the slightest inclination of her head. "Please," she said softly, her voice carrying neither pride nor discomfort. "You're making my patients nervous." The oldest man smiled through eyes that had clearly witnessed too much. "Ma'am," he replied, "if they knew who you were, they'd understand this still isn't enough." She glanced toward the trauma bay where another patient had just arrived and answered without hesitation. "Then help me where it matters." There was no dramatic speech, no explanation, no attempt to draw attention. She simply handed one of the men a box of blankets and directed another toward a frightened family struggling to comfort an injured child. Without question, each of the 7 obeyed instantly. Their movements revealed habits impossible to mistake. They responded to her instructions with the same disciplined confidence soldiers reserve for leaders they trust with their lives. Hospital staff exchanged bewildered looks. The charge physician quietly approached the commander. "I'm sorry," he said cautiously. "May I ask who you gentlemen are?" The commander extended his hand politely. "Former Delta operators," he answered. "We're here because we finally found the woman who made it possible for us to become former operators instead of names carved into stone." A hush settled over everyone close enough to hear. The words felt too heavy for the brightly lit hallway. The younger nurses who had whispered earlier stared at Emma with growing disbelief, struggling to connect the reserved woman they knew with the image those few words had painted. Emma, meanwhile, adjusted in 4-line without looking up. "Please don't do this here," she murmured. "People need care." "Exactly," the commander replied. "That's what you've always chosen." While the department slowly resumed its rhythm, fragments of an older story began surfacing, not through grand declarations but through quiet recollections exchanged between people who had survived together. Years earlier, in a remote conflict zone hidden from newspaper headlines, Emma had volunteered with an international humanitarian medical team. The assignment had promised difficult conditions, scarce supplies, and long days treating civilians caught between forces they neither understood nor controlled. It had never promised safety. Temporary operating tents had stood beneath relentless desert heat while helicopters rattled overhead, carrying wounded soldiers and frightened children alike. Emma had worked 18-hour shifts with barely enough clean water to wash blood from her hands before another casualty arrived. The commander described those days with remarkable restraint, never glorifying violence, speaking instead about exhaustion, fear, and the extraordinary courage required simply to continue helping strangers when every instinct demanded escape. During one particularly devastating attack, explosions tore through the medical compound without warning. Dust swallowed the air. Structures collapsed. Communication disappeared. Panic spread faster than fire. While trained soldiers searched for defensive positions, one civilian nurse ignored every order to evacuate. Emma moved deeper into the damaged field hospital instead, searching room after room for patients too injured to flee. She carried children through smoke so dense she could barely see. She treated strangers whose names she never learned. She returned again and again into collapsing corridors because someone might still be alive. "We kept telling her to leave," another operator said quietly, his voice rough with memory. "She kept asking one question." The young nurse listening nearby leaned forward unconsciously. "What question?" The veteran looked toward Emma before answering. "Is everyone else out?" No one spoke after that. The simplicity of those words weighed more heavily than any elaborate story could have. Emma continued changing dressings for an elderly patient, as though the conversation belonged to someone else. The scars covering her hands suddenly appeared different to those watching. They no longer seemed disfiguring. They seemed like pages from a book no one had bothered to read. The demanding visitor who had insulted her earlier slowly approached, shame replacing anger across his face. He struggled to find words but discovered there were none capable of undoing what had already been said. Emma spared him the burden. "Your father needs another scan," she said gently. "He'll be all right." She offered neither accusation nor forgiveness. She simply continued caring for his family. That quiet mercy hurt more than any reprimand could have. Hours later, after the last trauma patient had finally been stabilized, the commander stood beside a window overlooking the rain-soaked parking lot. Emma joined him only because he had waited patiently until every patient had been seen. For several moments they watched the rain together. Neither spoke. The silence stretched naturally, carrying years that words could never fully contain. Finally, the commander reached into his jacket and removed a small weathered envelope sealed with military insignia. "They finally approved it," he said. Emma looked at the envelope but made no move to take it. "I told them not to." "We know," he answered. "That's why it took so long." She accepted it carefully, almost reluctantly, her scarred fingers lingering against the worn paper. "It changes nothing," she whispered. "For you," he replied. "For the families who are still alive because of you, it changes everything." The surrounding staff watched from a respectful distance, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal without fully understanding its meaning. Then the youngest member of the Delta team stepped forward, his expression more emotional than the others. He had been unusually quiet all evening. Looking directly at Emma, he spoke with unmistakable gratitude. "My daughter graduated from college last month," he said. "She only exists because you refused to leave that day." Emma smiled softly, her eyes glistening for the first time. "I'm glad she had the chance." The young man nodded before adding words that caused every member of the team to lower their heads in silent remembrance. "There's something these people still don't know." The commander closed his eyes briefly, as though deciding whether a burden carried for years could finally be shared. When he looked back toward the gathered hospital staff, his voice became almost a whisper. "The scars everyone sees came from saving lives. he said. The sacrifice no one sees came from the child she never got to bring home after that mission. Emma held the weathered envelope against her chest without opening it, not because she feared what was inside but because she had already lived every word it could possibly contain. Around her the emergency department continued its endless rhythm, another ambulance arriving beneath flashing lights, another frightened family rushing through automatic doors, another life demanding immediate attention. Yet for those who had gathered near the nurses' station, time seemed suspended between the quiet woman they thought they knew and the extraordinary truth they were only beginning to understand. The commander looked toward the floor before speaking again, not with the practiced confidence of a decorated soldier but with the careful tenderness of a man protecting someone else's memory. Years earlier, amid the confusion of that attack, Emma had found a little girl no older than 6 trapped beneath shattered concrete inside the temporary medical clinic. The child had been terrified but alive. Emma had refused evacuation until rescuers reached her, staying inside a building everyone else believed would collapse completely. She shielded the girl with her own body when another blast tore through the structure, absorbing the heat and debris that left permanent scars across her skin. The rescuers reached them only moments later. Emma survived after months of surgeries and rehabilitation. The little girl did not. No military citation could erase that single loss, and no official commendation could silence the question Emma had quietly carried ever since. Wondering whether another minute, another decision, another path through the smoke might somehow have changed the ending. The commander unfolded the letter with slow, deliberate movements. "This isn't an award," he said. "It's the truth that was hidden because of classified operations. Every family represented by these 7 men asked that it finally be delivered." He handed the pages to Emma. Her eyes moved across the words, and although her expression hardly changed, tears gathered silently at their edges. The letter described operations that had remained sealed for years. It confirmed that her decision to stay behind had allowed dozens of wounded soldiers and civilians to be evacuated before enemy fire surrounded the compound. Intelligence recovered during that rescue had prevented a far larger humanitarian disaster that would have claimed countless innocent lives. History would never record her name. The people who had lived because of her already had. The hospital staff listened without interrupting. The young interns who had whispered about her scars felt their embarrassment deepen into genuine humility. The demanding visitor stepped closer, his father now resting comfortably after successful treatment, and with a trembling voice said the only honest words he had left. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Emma folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Then she met his eyes with the same quiet kindness she had shown every patient that day. "Most people do," she answered gently. "The important part is what they choose after they know better." No accusation lingered in her voice. No bitterness remained. Only an invitation to become kinder than they had been moments before. One of the younger nurses finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had quietly lived inside everyone's mind. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Emma looked around the emergency department, watching physicians racing toward another trauma room, custodians mopping rainwater from the entrance, volunteers guiding worried families through unfamiliar hallways. A faint smile touched her face. "Because every person here is carrying a story they don't announce," she said softly. "Mine was never more important than theirs." The words settled over the room with remarkable weight. They did not sound rehearsed. They sounded lived. The commander nodded slowly before turning toward his team. Without another command, all 7 operators stepped into a straight line. Their shoulders squared. Their expressions became solemn. In the middle of a crowded civilian hospital, surrounded by strangers who only hours earlier had overlooked the quiet nurse among them, the 7 veterans came to perfect attention. No speeches followed. No applause interrupted the moment. They simply stood with unwavering respect before the woman who had once placed every life above her own. Doctors stopped walking. Visitors lowered their phones. Conversations faded into silence. Even the steady beeping of distant monitors seemed strangely softer against the stillness. It lasted only a few seconds, yet everyone present would remember it for the rest of their lives. Eventually Emma laughed almost shyly and shook her head. "You're all making far too much of this," she said. The commander smiled. "No, ma'am. We spent years making far too little of it." One by one, the men embraced her with the quiet affection of people whose gratitude had waited too many years for expression. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, they turned and walked toward the exit. Before stepping through the automatic doors, the youngest operator glanced back. "My daughter became a nurse," he said. "She said she wanted to spend her life helping people she would probably never meet again. I never told her where that idea came from. I think she'll know now." Emma smiled, raising one scarred hand in farewell before turning immediately toward the next patient, whose call light had begun to blink. An elderly woman needed help sitting upright. A frightened teenager waited for test results. A little boy searched anxiously for his mother after a minor accident. Emma moved toward them with the same calm steps she had taken before anyone recognized her, because compassion had never depended on recognition. The scars on her hands caught the morning sunlight spilling through the hospital windows, no longer appearing as marks of brokenness but as quiet reminders that courage often leaves visible fingerprints. Those who had witnessed the morning carried something home that no medical chart could record. They remembered that appearances reveal almost nothing about the battles another person has survived. They remembered that the strongest people are often the ones who speak the least about what they have endured. Most of all, they remembered one simple truth that echoed long after the Delta team disappeared into the rain: some people wear medals beneath their clothes, while others wear them on their skin. Emma never framed the letter she received that day. She placed it inside the same faded canvas pouch resting quietly in her locker, beside memories she had never needed the world to applaud, then returned to caring for strangers whose names she might forget but whose pain she would never ignore. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, 7 families continued living ordinary, beautiful lives because one ordinary-looking nurse had once chosen extraordinary compassion over her own safety. If this story stayed with you, carry its kindness into the next face you meet, because the greatest stories are often the ones no one thinks to ask about until compassion opens the door.